questions and ideas, the things about this that you want to talk about. Now, because of the way the screen is, you can't see back here the full thing, but the question is the doctrine of the resurrection in the Old Testament. Now, we don't mean necessarily a full-blown, fully developed idea of resurrection, but when we say doctrine, I'm not sure exactly the best term. We're going to debate that, and I think we'll probably disagree on some of that. Yes, welcome this afternoon. I think we're right about 2 o'clock. Come on, watch. Oh, yeah, 2 o'clock. We try to start on time. We try to end on time, which is 3:30. On behalf of Mark Lanier and Becky Lanier, Mark is in New York, last I heard, and he is heading back this way after some business items, I think, that are taking his time. But I am delighted to be a part of today. My name is David Capes. I'm the Director of Academic Programming here at the library. We've got a lot of great staff and people around and visiting scholars as well. And we have a great group of panelists here that we're going to be introducing here in just a moment. Whoop, my heel caught. We're going to be chatting and agreeing about some doctrines. We're going to be looking at some texts together that will be appearing on the screen. If you have a Bible, it'd be great that you could open the Bibles there, and I hope you guys have a Bible or access to a Bible up here. We will make sure that we are talking about the same text, even though we might have different translations. Let me introduce our panelists for today. First of all, we'll start with John Goldingay, who comes to us from Oxford today. Now, John, what's the temperature over there in Oxford?
Probably about 15, about 60.
Okay, over here today it's 93, which is 34 degrees on your scale.
Okay. I was able to lie on my lounger on my patio this afternoon in the sunshine when it was a bit warmer.
Oh gosh, I didn't hear that. I didn't catch that. Did you catch it? Okay, all right. We're going to work on the sound a little bit, but let me just introduce John Goldingay. He is the David Allan Hubbard Professor of Old Testament Emeritus at Fuller Theological Seminary. He had undergraduate degree in University of Oxford, and his PhD from the University of Nottingham. He served at the University of Nottingham at St. John's College for a time, and most recently has retired, I guess, somewhat, from Fuller Theological Seminary. He's written a lot of important books, all of which you can find here at the Lanier Theological Library. And one of those is a commentary on the book of Daniel. And I think recently you've published one on Ecclesiastes as well, is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, yep. Ecclesiastes for another series. Amazing scholar, prolific scholar. He's written a series of books entitled Old Testament for Everyone, which is taking the Old Testament itself and putting it, as I like to say, on a shelf that everybody can reach. A shelf that not just for experts and not just for people that have had a theological education, but for everybody who's interested. He's written Old Testament theology, Genesis for everyone. And John, we're so glad to have you. Would you help me in welcoming John Goldingay here in Oxford? Secondly, we have Dr. Aubrey Buster seated right next to him at this point. She has a BA from Wheaton College in voice and English literature. Is that correct?
The BM.
A BS. Bachelor of Music. Okay. So later she will sing for us the Italian art song Vittoria Vittoria. All right, so we'll all enjoy that together. And she went ahead to stay at Wheaton College and did her MA in Biblical Exegesis. From there, and she was a student as well of John Walton, and they're still talking. In fact, they're neighbors. They live right across the street from each other, and her kids hang out at his house like a grandfather figure kind of stuff. Anyway, great story. And we're so pleased. In my years at Wheaton, she was one of the last people that I hired before coming here to Houston in 2019. So we're very proud. We had some great hires in those years, and you got rid of a good guy, but you also you also got a lot of good people as well. Important books. Her book, she's got a book about memory formation entitled "Remembering the Story of Israel: Historical Summaries and Memory Formation in Second Temple Judaism." Now that's a text, that's a terminology that you're going to hear a lot today, Second Temple Judaism. And we're going to define that for you because that sounds kind of far away, right? What does that actually mean? We'll be talking a little bit about that. So join me please in welcoming Dr. Aubrey Buster. I want to add that she and John are working on a commentary for a very prestigious series on the book of Daniel. And it's entitled, the commentary is the New International Commentary on the Old Testament. NICOT is its abbreviation. And the first volume is out this fall. Daniel 1 through 6, yeah. Daniel 1 through 6. Very good. All right, Andrew Perrin's and on the end. We're going to wait on John. Andrew Perrin joins us for the first time here at the Lanier Theological Library. He's a professor of Humanities and Social Sciences at Athabasca University in Calgary, Alberta. So you've come a long way. He did his master's degree at Trinity Western University, and then worked with people like Peter Flint, whose library we have here, and Marty Abegg as well. He did his PhD from McMaster University. He's a well-known Dead Sea Scrolls scholar, and we're so pleased that he's here to be with us today. He's taught at Trinity Western University for a time, and then now teaches at Athabasca University. Now, he's done a book recently, a book that I haven't gotten and a book I haven't yet seen, and I don't think you've seen the full copy yet. Lost Words and Forgotten Worlds is the title of it. Rediscovering the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, there could be a problem with that title because he has lost and worlds there really close together, and John Walton has the franchise on the Lost Worlds books, the Lost World of everything. How many Lost Worlds are there, John? 8 Lost Worlds. Okay, so he's got that franchise, just like other people have other franchises. At any rate, please join me in welcoming Dr. Andrew Perrin. All right, finally, John Walton is going to be giving our keynote lecture tomorrow night. He's going to be looking at the book of Daniel, particularly chapter 12. But he's a professor of Old Testament Emeritus at Wheaton College. He's, what did I say, old?
Yeah, you said I'm old.
I was reading
That's a
ahead,
given.
which is not a good idea, reading ahead. He has an MA from Wheaton College. Wheaton has a big influence here. Have you noticed? Mm-hmm. Wheaton Graduate School in Biblical Studies, and did a PhD at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. The Jewish Institute of Religion, Hebrew, and Cognate Languages. He taught for a good while at Moody Institute in Chicago, Moody Bible Institute, and then in 2001 he came to Wheaton College, where he has become a really kind of an institution there, well known by the students, well known by people really all over the world. Now, he's written a lot of books. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Ancient Near Eastern Thought and the Old Testament. The Lost World of Genesis 1, The Lost World of Genesis 2. No, it's 2? No, anyway. The Lost World of Adam and Eve. The Lost World of what? What else, John?
The Flood, the Israelite Conquest, the Lost World of the Torah. Yeah. I lose worlds.
All those things. So lots of lost worlds out there in a world that's lost.
Yeah.
And then he and Aubrey are working together on the book of Daniel, chapters 1 to 6 with the NICOT series. Please join me in welcoming the one and only John Walton. I've got a series of questions that I want to share today, and what we're going to do is we're going to start with John Goldingay there, and it's a great question because, you know, it's kind of a starting question for the big question that we're looking at today. Is the doctrine of the resurrection found in the Old Testament? So, John, if you don't mind, let's begin with a question that you suggested, which I had not thought about, What did the Israelites, what did the Jews think happened when people died? And why did they die in the first place?
Well, what happened when they died? Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Okay. When you die, they worked out what happened when you die simply by looking up. I think really they know that when you die, you don't cease to exist, but the life goes out of you. And they knew that then, as it were, the ideal was that the family would put you into the family tomb, a sort of cave, where people from the family who died already were, and you would join grandma and so on there, and you'd probably notice, well, some people would notice, that there wasn't quite as much of those people as there was the last time you looked. That's what would happen to you bodily. And they seem to have assumed that, in effect, the same kind of thing happened to you spiritually, if you like, to the inner person. You didn't cease to exist, but you became lifeless. But you still existed. And that's why it was possible, for instance, for the medium at Endor to get Samuel to come out from Sheol, which is a kind of non-physical equivalent of the grave, in order to come and give a message to Saul. So when you died, you carried on existing, but you became lifeless. Sheol wasn't a place of punishment, it was just a place where you were going to have a long sleep. The Old Testament doesn't talk much about why, except in those very opening chapters, or in that one opening chapter. Those opening chapters of Genesis say that God intended it to be the case that you would have what we would call eternal life. You would have a life that went on. Probably, though opinions differ about this, the implication in those chapters is that you would die, but then you would eat from the tree of life, and that would give you what we might call resurrection life. But the thing that went wrong at the beginning meant that didn't happen. So instead of you going to Sheol and then enjoying resurrection life, you just go to Sheol and that's it.
So the word Sheol, where does it come from, John? We hear about Sheol here, Sheol there. Where does it come from?
It's the Hebrew word for the netherworld. We really don't know the etymology of it or its associations. It doesn't have easily recognizable cognates in other languages. But it's just the word that they use to describe the netherworld. It's one of several, but it's the most familiar one. It occurs some 60 plus times in the Old Testament. And so sometimes it's translated hell, although that can be misleading because Sheol is not a place of punishment. It's simply a place where everybody goes when they die. Their spirits go there. Their nephesh goes there.
Their nephesh. So the spirit, is that the best way to understand that? Spirit, soul?
Yeah, our terminology can be problematic. The spirit word, of course, is ruach in Hebrew, and the typical understanding is that the ruach is given by God and it returns to God. The nephesh proceeds to the netherworld. And nephesh is what's sometimes translated soul, but that's misleading. It's more like the person, the self, your identity. So they believe that continued to exist.
So when a person died, they did not cease to exist.
Correct.
Their body became lifeless. Was that the term I think, John, you used, right? Became lifeless.
Yep.
And yet, there was a part of them that lived on.
That's what they believed, yes.
Yeah, okay. So Andrew, let's come to you at this point. Our Bible translations, and this strikes me because John mentioned it, our Bible translations sometimes take some liberties in translating these words and giving us these ideas that might end up leading us into the wrong place, like translating something hell, for example, instead of Sheol or some other place, going down to the pit, that kind of thing. How have Bible translations helped us, aided us, misled us in ideas about death and afterlife?
So a great question. I been thinking a bit about this, and Sheol's a great example. I'll kind of maybe pick up where you left off. I asked ChatGPT how many English Bible translations are there, and it said somewhere between 450 and 900. I thought that's a very specific answer. Thank you. But let's just say a lot, I think is the technical term. It's a lot of Bible translations, which is a good thing. But I think when we come to reading the Bible, it's got to not forget that that's our starting point with an English translation, or even in a Hebrew text edition or a Greek text edition. That is really the end point of a lot of long, arduous homework that scholars and translators have done. And we don't want to lose sight of that. Translation is, we might think it's about words, but it's actually about capturing meaning and trying to communicate meaning, which is not an easy thing if you've done any translation, whether it's in Hebrew, Greek, or Spanish, or Mandarin, or whatever it is. And Sheol's a good example of this. I was reading an example, like Deuteronomy 32:22, the Song of Moses, right? A very old part of the Pentateuch. This is they cross the Red Sea, and Moses breaks out in a song. And later on in that section, there's a reference to Sheol. And so if we take something like the New American Standard Bible, let's just look at some comparisons here, which is very literal. It will just tell you it means the lowest part of Sheol. There's a few words there, but that's what it's leaving it up to you to figure it out, or to ask John on a panel what it means. Something like the NIV, I think, would translate this as the lowest parts of death, or something like this. So they're capturing this idea that there's death. In ancient texts, we look at the Septuagint, right, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. They're also wrestling with this. What does it mean? And their translation, or if you might translate it, they use the word Hades. Hades below. Well, Hades is not Sheol. So this is an ancient translator trying to go, all right, I have a sense of what this means. What's my approximate cultural equivalent? Now, I don't think any of those are wrong per se, but it's a missed opportunity for us to not ask, well, what is it, and why are they translated a certain way? And I find that anytime we can open up that gap and then kind of step into it, and you can appreciate then, okay, this is what the Septuagint was trying to do. Here's what they're trying to work with. Very rarely are we talking about a simple one-to-one equivalence, especially now when it's a complex term like Sheol or Nephesh, all these terms about what it means to be a human being, and then what happens to you. There's going to be a lot of interpretation that needs to go along with that. So I find that in of itself to be really interesting, to pay attention. Why is something translated a certain way? And what is it about the culture and time, ancient or modern, that might have influenced that?
Anybody want to add to that? John?
Since John Goldingay is here with
Can I
us,
just add a thing? Can I just add something?
Yeah, please add something.
The New Testament, at least occasionally, in the New Testament occasionally, Hades gets translated hell, and that's really then confusing. Hades is okay, I think, as an equivalent of Sheol, but when you start calling it hell, then that's confusing.
Indeed. John Walton.
So since John Goldingay is here with us remotely, I actually use a quote of his when I talk about translations. If I get it straight, it was something like, translation is a series of compromises that different people make. And that's always the case. Anytime you're moving from one language to another, you've not only got to carry an actual word that makes sense in the culture, but there are ideas that are latent in the word that also come along for the ride. And often it's those latent ideas that can either be missed or added and make translation difficult.
Aubrey.
One thing that I think I want to add to this discussion is that we have a very different kind of cultural model when we approach these texts. We're often looking, even in our translations, for equivalents to, well, what happens after you die? In our mind, there's like the good place and the bad place, and you might call the good place different names and the bad place different names. But in the Old Testament, we see a variety of expressions used for what happens after you die. Some of them are, you go to Sheol, this place, and we often grab onto that as we also have a place that we go to. But they'll also describe themselves as being gathered to their kin or sleeping with their ancestors. And I'm not getting this distinction, I'm borrowing this from John Levinson, who's written a book on the resurrection and the restoration of Israel. And he's pointed out that that too is a vision of what happens after you die. That there appears to be an unfortunate death marked by going to this place called Sheol, where it's a shadowy existence. It's usually described with metaphors of loneliness and separation from God and from family and from your society. The Psalms, of course, are the number one place for this, yes. Dr. Goldingay, of course, has written about this. But then there is a version of what he calls the fortunate death. That is the life well lived, where you often live to a proper old age, you die surrounded, in good standing with your community, and those people are not usually described as going down to Sheol. They're described as being gathered to their kin. And I think he makes an interesting suggestion that we might be limited in our own cultural model, focusing on this place that you go after you die, when the ancient Israelite imagination might be even more expansive than that, the idea of a fortunate versus an unfortunate death.
Good point. A lot of different ways of talking about this unclear reality, this thing that's about to happen. So we're not talking yet about the resurrection from the dead, are we?
No.
We're talking about the life being, the body being lifeless. We're talking about the soul returning to God who gave it. I think that's Ecclesiastes. The soul returns to God who gave it. And then we begin thinking about the idea of resurrection. So Aubrey, let me ask you, how does it get started? How does the idea, this is an easy question. I threw you an easy one. No, that's not true. It's a hard question. How does this idea of the resurrection get started, do you think? What's going on? And that's going to be a question I'd love to hear from everybody, or a response.
The doctrine of the resurrection begins with the person of God and God's relationship with Israel. This is really what it extends out of. I won't give away my answer to the question, is there a doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament? But I do think whether there is or not, it will end up being a working out of Israel's thought about God and then bringing this into different situations. If God really is, as Israel comes to claim, a God of life and not of death, if God really does have the capacity to bring life where there is death, really does have the power to both bring life to things that don't have life and to give life to that which is dead. Amen? Yes, can we amen at these panels?
Amen.
Then it's possible that when death is something that might separate the people of God from God, that God could overcome this. So then this is also rooted in God's relationship with Israel. God makes a series of promises to the people of Israel, some which they see fulfilled, many of which they don't. The post-exilic period, or Second Temple Judaism, which is my favorite period. Yes, amen, Dr. Perrin.
Amen.
Challenged this the seeming stability of this relationship in a lot of ways. The people of Israel and Judah were defeated in succession by ancient empires who served other gods. They were separated from the land where they believed that they were going to commune with God, and this challenged the stability of that relationship in several ways. And so this idea that God might, at some point, whether we get there or not in the Old Testament, defeat death, I think is an outworking of these fundamental theological statements, rather than maybe a philosophical conception of the self, as we see in Greek thought, right? What portion of the person is immortal and what portion of the person isn't, and where do we go after you die? Any thought that we're going to see in ancient Israel related to death and its end is going to stem from these two fundamental realities: who God is and what God can do, and is God going to be able to keep God's promises to Israel in the face of these really desperate challenges.
Andy, take that up.
I just wanted, for the record, what your favorite period was the Second Temple Judaism. I want to make sure everybody heard that.
Yes.
Yes. Not to drive a wedge between neighbors.
That's right.
But I think I'll kind of pick up on that as well, Aubrey. I think you're right, and there's also another context within this space that I think is why these questions are starting to be asked at an increasing regularity with increasing complexity of answers, and more often by more people. By this point in time, we're dealing, I think, with an ongoing experience of upheaval, even trauma of life under empire. And that means many empires ebbing and flowing. I think if you have a sense of even the geography of where Jerusalem is, there's a lot of comings and goings, for folks that have traveled or lived there, and you get a sense of, that ancient Near Eastern map that you learned about maybe in your Sunday school class or your Bible 101. This is a space that's always going back and forth, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, and then the Greeks. And I think that there's a few things that are happening in this period, many things, but one that strikes me is all of those experiences and the ongoing attempts to answer that, we have ancestral promises, but this is not adding up. This is not adding up. Is there something more that we haven't thought about? And that is a really interesting, I think, space to step into, because then you start to have these conversations and hearing some of those things, whether it's a scribe or their community or a tradition that's trying to work it out, an ancestral tradition, a present reality that's not really adding up with those promises, and then opening up that question, is there something more? And that, I think, is where you have the kind of very fertile ground for these types of answers to come forward.
Dr. Goldingay, would you want to get in on that question?
Okay, I should say that I can't hear much of what the others say, so if I repeat what they say, or if I contradict what they say, I don't know. What I would say, the answer to your original question way back is, there is no doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament. And there is no growth of that kind that Andrew was just talking about within the Old Testament itself. There is growth outside of the Old Testament in Jewish thinking in the Second Temple period, but there isn't within the Old Testament. The nearest you get to any reference to resurrection in the Old Testament is Daniel 12, about which we don't want to talk too much because John's going to give a lecture about it, I think, tomorrow. But the significant thing, a significant thing about that is that God told people in the 2nd century, when people were being martyred, persecuted for not being willing to live by the Torah, God told them that people had been martyred, that some people had been martyred, and some people had caused the martyring were going to be raised from the dead. But that wasn't resurrection, that wasn't a doctrine of resurrection. You don't get a doctrine of resurrection until Jesus has come, because it's only because of Jesus that there is any resurrection.
Okay. So no doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament, but just maybe a hint in Daniel 12. Is that a good way to put it?
I think it's even misleading to say that's a hint, because it's there for different reasons. It's not like it's not really resurrection. It's only some people and so on, and it's who knows whether it's going to be, where it's going to happen and how long it's going to be. It's not what we would call a doctrine of resurrection or a reality of resurrection, such as comes about through Jesus.
Okay. John?
I think that it's very difficult for us today to take into account how significant is the idea that they found their identity in their community, not in themselves as individuals. That can be overstated, it can be, but that's a very difficult transition. When you think about it, the idea of a doctrine of resurrection usually, of course, is bodily resurrection, which means it's individual resurrection. And that's important to us as we live in a very individualistically oriented society. But they did not. And for them, what was important was whether the clan and the community continued to exist. And that's a different kind of subject. It's on the same wave of thinking, because it talks about existence after death. But a community dying is a different thing than a person dying. And a community coming back to life is a different thing from a person coming back to life. And so we have shaped, and this doesn't start with us, of course, it goes all the way back into Greek thinking and Christian theology of the individual. Jesus as an individual was resurrected. and we as individuals. But that's not really the framework that people thought about in ancient Israel. So for them to think about an individual coming back to life, it just wouldn't be the kind of thing that would be of significance to them. And that's why we find that some of the passages that we associate with people coming back to life may well be focused on community ideas rather than individuals. And that all has to be parsed out.
Okay.
I want to extend and maybe slightly, I don't know if diverge is the right word, but extend what you're saying. Because, I mean, to answer this question, I don't think there's a doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament, but the doctrine of resurrection is consonant with what we find in the Old Testament and emerges out of the Old Testament scriptures and then the person of Jesus Christ. And one of the things that we can learn about the doctrine of resurrection from the Old Testament, which is something that I think we can do once it exists, is to maybe challenge, I think, this individual communal distinction. Because even in the New Testament, I would say, you don't have to amen me this time, that Christianity doesn't have a doctrine of individual resurrection. We too have a doctrine of communal resurrection. That is, we will be raised, those of us who are raised to life will be raised as the people of God, yes? And so I think this is an important distinction to make when we see in the Old Testament scriptures these texts that we're going to look at in a minute about the community being raised and restored. The Christian doctrine is connected to that. The idea that the community will be raised and restored. So I actually think reading these texts will help us maybe correct us out of our Greek ways of thinking. We like some Greek ways of thinking for New Testament scholars, but it helps us correct that own thinking in our life.
I'm reminded of Paul's words there in Corinthians where he says, we shall not all sleep, but we will all be changed.
Yes, yes.
So there's a sense in which not I am going to be changed.
That's right.
There's not so much a focus on just me, my, mine,
yes,
as much as we together as the people, the body of Christ, etc.
And then the enemies are resurrected to something else, yes? But it's still in relationship, it's still based on the relationship.
Still a relationship, on a negative relationship.
Exactly. It's all a socially grounded doctrine.
Yeah. Andy, did you?
I wanted to loop back because I think this has already opened up kind of different thoughts in my own mind, because I love these types of panels. The original question on the screen, I would argue with some nuance, yes, but not for the reason we might think, because by definition, asking the question of the Old Testament is asking the question, is this doctrine somehow at play in a Christian canon? The Old Testament is the first generous half of a Christian Bible. By definition, that's a Christian canon. I think if we ask the question, is this in the Hebrew Scriptures in the Second Temple period, then that's a more nuanced answer. But I think similar to translations, we can ask about translations. We should also be asking about tradition, and which tradition do we find ourselves in? And if we're reading this as the Old Testament means we're reading it in light of with a New Testament in a Christian Bible, then that perhaps changes the way we might approach the question. In a way, we could ask the same question: Is it in the Hebrew Bible as a Jewish canon? Is it in the Hebrew Scriptures before this in the Second Temple period? And then there's some nuance. But I think that term, my mind, I see this question automatically went to resurrection, but then I went, well, in the Old Testament. That's a canonical context that I think then shapes and influences why we're asking the question and perhaps how we answer it.
Let's take a look at some of those texts. They're going to be on the screen. I'll read those to you. We're not going to look so much at Daniel 12 yet. I'm going to let John off the hook because he's talking about that tomorrow night. So we're going to move past Daniel 12, but it's one of those passages that people often cite as evidence that there is a burgeoning belief or an idea in resurrection, whether it's corporate, whether it's individual or not. So here's the second text. This is Psalm 26:19. Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise.
Isaiah.
Those who dwell in the dust will awake. Maybe this is Psalm 22.
That's
This is
Isaiah 26.
What is
You're reading Isaiah 26.
That's Isaiah. I don't know why it says Psalm.
That was a quiz for us,
I didn't
just
do
to make
that.
sure that we're real.
It's not my mistake.
real.
ISA, PSA.
It's Isaiah, yeah. Your dead shall live, their corpses shall rise. Those who dwell in the dust will awake and shout for joy, for your dew is radiant dew, and the earth will give birth to those long dead. Explain. John Walton.
I get to start, huh? This is sort of where things begin in the conversation of resurrection, because even Daniel, oops, we're not talking about that. Even Daniel starts with this verse, and so it's a very important beginning. It's a controversial passage because again we have the discussion: are they thinking corporately, or are they thinking individually, or some mix between the two? There have been a number of dissertations done on this passage and its surrounding context that try to parse out the issue. This is all happening in the context of the Rephaim, the heroic dead, and Israel's dead are being contrasted to them. And so you have to ask about the Rephaim and what people thought about the Rephaim in the netherworld. And so it's a very complex passage. Again, it certainly becomes the root from which resurrection grows. But it still has, in my view, others less so, and maybe we'll hear some of that, still has a little more of a communal focus, even though that doesn't rule out some sense of individuals and their destiny.
It's a challenge because we're only reading one verse here, and there is some before and some afterward. Mm-hmm. Dr. Goldingay, we'll ask you, what are your thoughts about Isaiah 26:19 as part of this discussion?
It's about the resurrection of the nation, the restoration of the bringing the nation back to life. It's nothing to do with resurrection.
Do you want to elaborate?
No. Why would you want me to elaborate? I mean, it's better if I say it straight, isn't it? It's the same as Ezekiel 37, with that terrific vision of God bringing back to life the the Israeli nation during the exile. It's bringing the nation back to life. If you already know about resurrection, and then you go and read Ezekiel or Isaiah, then you can find resurrection there. But if you don't already know about resurrection, in our kind of sense, in the New Testament kind of sense, then you wouldn't find resurrection there.
So, having read the New Testament and seen the lots of evidence of Jesus being raised from the dead, being exalted to the right hand of God, etc., having done that, then when we come to this text, we're sort of wired to read this text as a resurrection text.
Yeah, we're right. We're wired to read it in a different way from what it meant, which is okay because the New Testament does that. But if we want to know what God was saying to His people through Isaiah, then it's not a thing about resurrection.
Okay, Andrew.
As you maybe can sense, I like trying to think about how do ideas change and develop, and what are real human beings, scribes, communities doing and participate in that process. And I think this is a good example of that. So I'll maybe look from this forward, from the book that must not be named, Daniel, we won't talk about this, but maybe Ezekiel we could talk about. There's a text I'll touch on this evening in the evening lecture among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a text we didn't have before, and it's called Pseudo-Ezekiel. At least it's a modern scholarly title. And it more or less engages the Valley of Dry Bones, Ezekiel 37, at least in this one part, and it reimagines it. And it's by doing that, this scribe or this tradition is asking some of these questions, so that one of the elements that's introduced is it seems to be more articulate towards some sort of resurrection. And it draws also, like you were saying, John was saying about Daniel 12, or Daniel 12:2 drawing on Isaiah in some way. So does this text, by adding in that the dead will arise and give praise. That arising and singing seems to be coming from Isaiah 26:19. So I don't have the answer for what does this text actually mean by itself. I'm far more interested in how has this generated a whole lot of other conversations that saw something there that was worth talking about. And it's interesting when you see a text that's so, in a way, so short, obviously in its own context, it really does seem to spark a lot of questions and conversations in texts that go forward in the Second Temple period, be it Daniel or in this case, the text from Qumran. where it's supplying some of that interpretive grist, even some of the terms that end up informing how other texts start to make something perhaps more articulate that's either nascent or perhaps not there in the original context.
Dr. Buster, would you like to add something?
Yes.
I was hoping you would. So
I think there are a few interpretive principles that we can draw from this text that might be helpful when we're talking about the conversation of either is there a doctrine of resurrection in the Old Testament, or what can we learn about the doctrine of resurrection that we now have from the Old Testament, which I think are two separate questions. The first is that this is clearly a poetic text. And this is our issue with every single text that we're going to look at today, and every single text that's used as a resurrection text in the Old Testament. I'll often see the question posed, is this language metaphorical or literal? And when I look at this passage, I say, it's all metaphorical. It's poetry. Even if it's referring to a resurrection of the dead, it's referring to it in a metaphorical way. And these are one of our challenges, that we're looking at metaphors for life and death, and we're needing to interpret them. We do not get a reference to a literal resurrection, a doctrine of literal resurrection of the dead, until we have a literal resurrection from the dead, which is the raising of Jesus. And so this is important to consider when we're addressing any of these questions, that we're always going to be dealing with them in terms of metaphors. I'm going to build on what Andrew said to maybe hint at something we should be paying attention to tomorrow night. I won't give away anything, but as kind of a teaser trailer. What we're going to see is the origin story of resurrection when we see how later scribes are using previous texts. Some scholars will argue that the doctrine of resurrection is a foreign import into Judaism. We'll connect it to things like Zoroastrianism, and there's reasons for this. Yes, if you love Zoroastrianism, we can talk later. Or that it's related to modes of Greek philosophy. And I think you're going to see in the interaction between Isaiah 26 and Daniel 12, and then some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, that we see that the people writing these texts are always interacting with this previous language and building on it. Sometimes restating messages that the previous text said, sometimes giving them new meanings, and then giving them new meanings again, and then giving them meanings again, until we get to a point where these images might represent literal resurrection of the dead, even if this passage itself, in its original context, didn't. And then the last thing, very briefly, if we do think that the doctrine of the resurrection that is presented in the New Testament is consonant with what we find in the Old Testament, I think we see several points in this passage that can help us. So first of all, once again, we see that emphasis on the community. It's your dead that shall live. Why? This is a divine response to their cry. If we look previously, O Lord, in distress, they sought you, your people. They're with child, they writhed, but we gave birth only to wind. So you're in a painful experience, but it doesn't produce anything like a child. And then God responds with life. And this is how resurrection is going to be presented in the New Testament. So we see theological principles about who God is and what God's relationship is to God's people that is going to help us understand the fully fledged, literal, quote unquote, doctrine of the resurrection of the New Testament.
John?
So all my colleagues here have brought up, I think, a very important attention that we need to give to methodology and terminology. A term label that I found very useful recently is that I talk about situated readings. It is most comfortable for any of us to read from who we are and where we are. And for us as Christians, when we read the Old Testament as part of a canon that includes the New Testament, we adopt a situated reading. We read as Christians. Sometimes we adopt a situated reading of a theologian who wants to figure out theology of resurrection or whatever it might be. And so we adopt a situated vantage point, and we read from that vantage point. It's very natural. It's the easiest way for us to do it. And we can adopt any number of situated identities that relate to us. You can read as a Nigerian or a Guatemalan. You can read as a woman or as a refugee. You can read from all these situated readings. And it's important that we recognize that that's exactly what they are, a situated reading. And so one of the things that I like to say is that, but when I'm reading the Hebrew Bible, I want to start by trying to read from an Israelite situated reading, from their vantage point, to understand what it would have meant in their time to their audience. And we can't always recover that, and even when we think we can, we might be off base. But we can give it a shot. Try to understand the words that they used and what they meant, trying to understand their cultural context. I live in that kind of attempt to find that world. So that's an Israelite vantage point. It's their situated reading. So I like to start with that, but then to recognize that other situated readings are out there, they exist, and those situated readings can identify truth. Even if they don't get at what the original situation was, they can still unlock truth for us. And so when we look at some of these passages in the Hebrew Bible, they wouldn't have pertained to resurrection or had any thought in their minds about that. But certainly when we read it as Christians, as theologians, we can't help but see those elements, because to some extent our vantage point is colored by the Christian glasses that we wear and by reading through the New Testament. So I think I don't want to say we have to choose one or the other. I want to say that both have value to us, and we should be intentional about knowing what we're about, which one we're doing. I don't think that an Israelite text and context situated reading rules out Christian readings. But likewise, I don't want to take my Christian reading and obliterate, totally lose an Israelite situated reading. So it's just stages in our process, and I think that can be helpful methodologically as we think about what we're doing.
Very helpful. Let's look at another text. This is actually from Psalms. Psalm 22, and I'll read it for you if you can't see it. To Yahweh indeed shall all who sleep in the earth bow down. Before him shall bow down all who go down to the dust, and I shall live for him. This might be, I don't know if this is a common text, but it's one that I was reading recently. And it's interesting that it comes at Psalm 22, which is the psalm that Jesus quoted from the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's how it begins, but then it goes down to this here at the end. Now, there could be a variety of ways to read this, Dr. Goldingay, and I'm curious, when you look at this, how do you take this within the context of Psalm 22?
I take it to refer to the fact that everybody who die, everybody's going to die. The people who are going to sleep in the dust are the people who are going to sleep in the dust. They haven't done that yet, but all the people who are going to die are going to bow down. So again, it's not about resurrection. It's about what's going to happen in this life.
Okay, very good. Andy,
I'm trying to look at this in. We see some variation here with the Septuagint. Obviously, they're trying to make sense of something as well, which is interesting. But I think some of the things that we've already touched on, maybe just resurface here. A big, important, obvious one is metaphor and poetry. That I think is important to keep in mind, as well as I think Dr. Goldingay trying to start with an outline of some traditional views in the Old Testament, and images of that, sleeping and being in the dust and descent downward. I think that what I see here is some of those expressions in a poetic, metaphorical context. If I'm not going to hang my hat on Isaiah 26:19, I think I'd be even more generous with something like this to try and see what it's expressing in that poetic, metaphorical context, and how some of those ideas and images are coming from a traditional Israelite view, perhaps, if we can call it that, or a situated reading. And then I'd be curious to kind of hunt around and do some comparing with, the Septuagint and why they're wrestling with it, because not unlike some of the examples we've seen already, there's some variation in what even ancient readers of this text would think.
For those who don't know, what is the Septuagint? You've been referring to Septuagint.
Yeah.
Tell us what that is. Some of us know, but
for sure.
Yeah.
I was referred to the Septuagint at some family dinner, which goes to show what type of family dinners we have at our house. And my brother thought it was a skin disease I had come down with. So I'm glad to tell you that the Septuagint is not an affliction, at least to most. This is the Greek translation, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures. As the kind of ascendancy of Greek thought and culture and the language, There's either an interest or need or opportunity that some ancient Jewish scribes saw to start translating, starting with the Pentateuch, Genesis through Deuteronomy, and then increasingly throughout the rest of the Hebrew Scriptures. That then includes other Greek compositional works, some of the books of Maccabees, translations of books like Tobit, for example. So the Septuagint is really a very ambitious ancient Jewish translation project that includes all of the Hebrew Scriptures and goes to show the literary activity and scribal activity that happens not just in Hebrew and Aramaic, but also then into Greek.
And I would say that those translations also reflect a situated reading of the Hellenistic period in Second Temple Judaism, and that comes through in their translations.
Yeah. So the Judaism at this point is being Hellenized. It's being brought into conformity in some ways, or at least into conversation with Greek culture, Greek thought, Greek ways. And that's why I think we have Hades earlier as a translation, because that's kind of trying to compromise, using the term earlier, trying to make a compromise with the new word that you're trying to choose at that point. How do we escape, if it's all metaphor, how do we escape metaphor? I mean, can we escape metaphor? Should we escape metaphor? I mean, because John, you don't think we should. Why should we not?
We can't. Well, we can't, and therefore we shouldn't. I mean, unless you use metaphor, you can't talk about God and God's relationship with us at all. So we have to use metaphor. But that's not a disadvantage, because metaphor is a very rich way of being able to talk. I've done it, you see. I said it's a rich way. And I've used the word rich as a metaphor to describe the process of understanding the Scriptures. We need metaphor in order to be able to say things. So it's great that the Scriptures are full of metaphor.
All language is referential anyway, isn't it? I mean, it's just referencing reality as we know it. Here's one more text. Let me see. Let's go down to it here. And this is a very famous passage. It's long, chapter 37 of the book of Ezekiel. This may be one of the easier ones for you guys to talk about. And the part that I want to highlight is after the valley of dry bones, this is what the sovereign Lord says: "My people, I am going to open your graves and bring you up from them. I will bring you back to the land of Israel. Then you, my people, will know that I am the Lord," the divine name. "When I open your graves and bring you up from them, I will put my spirit in you, and you will live, and I will settle you in your own land. Then you will know that I am the Lord, and I, the Lord, have spoken. And I have done it, declares the Lord." All right, John Walton.
So I think this brings out another important element to look at. We talked about bodily resurrection as kind of a qualifier of a certain way of thinking about resurrection. Another question we can ask about if there is any kind of concept of resurrection, communal, individual, whatever, exactly where does that take place? Where is the resurrected life going to be? And this text makes it pretty clear that they're talking about the land of Israel. They don't specify it as new creation or anything of that sort, but in the land of Israel. And again, we can see the corporate element very clearly. It's my people that are involved. And so, and of course, it's a whole valley of dry bones which have regained their flesh. So in this sense, the communal aspect, I think, is pretty clear, and the temporal, although future, and terrestrial context is pretty clear. And I think those are all elements we have to take into consideration. We can still, of course, see that as metaphorical if we move to a Christian situated reading. And that's how situated readings work.
Okay. Dr. Goldingay, would you follow up on that? Your thoughts about
Yeah, that's this time I could hear what John said. And usually it's really weird whether I can hear or not. But I think what John said is great. The thing I'd want to add is that the terrific thing about the fact that God is talking about the resurrection, the restoration of Israel in the Isaiah passage and in Ezekiel 37 is the hope that it gives, the promise that it gives of God's faithfulness to his people, to his nation. And whether you want to apply that to the Jewish people today, or whether you want to apply it to the church, it's fantastically good news that God brings his people back to life. Whereas if we focus on reading back our New Testament understanding of resurrection after death and life in the New Jerusalem, reading that back into the Old Testament passages, we miss the distinctively wonderful thing that God is saying in Ezekiel 37 and Isaiah 26 about God bringing his people back to life in this world.
Aubrey, go ahead, and then Andy.
So I think there are a few elements of this passage that really distinguishes it from the other resurrection texts that we've looked at today, and I think it's important to look at those distinctions because we can often collapse them when we're looking at a group of texts that are possible precedents of resurrection in the New Testament. This one has several more explicitly, I think, political elements than the other two passages do. You'll note, for example, that this is a valley of dry bones. These are not buried bones. They have not gone down into the dust, this metaphor for burial. They are laying exposed in the middle of a valley. And then when the sinews are put back, and God says specifically, this is my house Israel, when the sinews and the flesh are put back on them, then they are raised up a vast multitude, right? Likely a military marshal, an army, this image. And so this really is emphasizing Israel's military defeat and the accomplishment of the curse language that had been set upon Israel at the end of Deuteronomy has emphasized that has been fulfilled, and yet God will reverse that. So I think Ezekiel 37, even more explicitly perhaps than the Isaiah passage or the Psalm passage, is relating specifically to Israel's political military defeat as a result of these covenant curses coming upon them. They have died a shameful burial, their bones have been exposed, and God is going to reverse that through the reviving work of God's Spirit and bring them back to the land of Israel, as has already been represented. So I think there are several clues in this passage that it is explicitly political and communal.
More politically sort of focused. And as I've read that text before, I thought about these bones being scattered in the desert kind of thing as evidence of, because you would properly bury a body. That's typically. Right. And yet those that die in battle, or those maybe who died along the way to exile, maybe were never properly buried.
And this is a standard part of curses in the ancient world. Yes, may your bones lie, and may the vultures pick from them, may no one be there to bury your dead. And so this is an explicit curse imagery, or curse image in this sense.
I've never used that curse myself.
Yeah.
I may have thought it, but I never used that myself. Andy, what are your thoughts about this same passage, Ezekiel 37?
Yeah, thanks. I'll maybe kind of pivot in a different direction as well. I don't think this is a resurrection text. I think this is a restoration text. For many of the reasons I think we've kind of heard about a return, thinking about kind of some core elements of Israelite heritage and promises. Land and lineage are a big part of that. So I think it's a restoration text. And then when we frame it that way, we can look at, who carries that meaning on? Because we can trace, as an example I gave before, to a pseudo-Ezekiel that tries to make something like a resurrection idea out of this. Another text we find among the Dead Sea Scrolls, written in Aramaic, is got a very descriptive modern title. It's called the New Jerusalem text. Bet you can guess what it's about. New Jerusalem, which is also a really important part of Ezekiel's visions a few chapters after this. And that text has this visionary journey, much like Ezekiel gets, where there's an angel measuring the city and the temple, and it's this massive city, and it's totally empty except for a functioning priesthood. And this is all in a dream vision context that's happening. That seems to be anticipated, taking this idea in a way that if this is a restoration text and everybody's coming back, we better make sure that build the place and have the infrastructure to sustain it. Because restoration and homecoming or something like this would then necessitate different requirements in the future, unlike or different from if you had individual bodies, resurrected and walking around. So I think when we look at this as a restoration text, then all of a sudden we can see, who else is maybe thinking in those terms, and how are they trying to articulate that? Because that's a different idea that might require different things in the future.
John?
And that's,
John Walton.
I think, one of the interesting things this draws out, that when we do situated readings, we may find that we kind of massage out some new truths that are very important to us. But we have to be careful because in the process we can miss something. And if we only engage in our situated Christian reading and kind of see Ezekiel 37 as a metaphor for resurrection, we might miss some important theology about restoration that we ought to be getting from that passage that's inherently there in the Israelite situated reading.
And if I can add to that as well, I think it's important that we kind of recognize that metaphor is not the bad guy. I had an undergraduate theology professor, I'll never forget, I remember looking at me across the seminar table saying, which communicates more truth, a Jane Austen novel or a newspaper? And that really stuck with me, and I'm still laying awake at night thinking about this. Metaphor communicates can be very deep and complex meaning. We just have to wrestle with it differently. So I think that's something that's more our modern problem. We associate fact and truth, and whereas we look at things like poetry and metaphor and art and go, well, that's something different. I'm not sure it is. I think we miss an opportunity to, when we do readings of any situation, just to ask ourselves, are we expecting that this genre of literature is communicating something true and factual versus that? And I think metaphor is not the bad guy here. Metaphor is actually a huge opportunity to find deep meaning.
Let me go back to the first text that we talked about. John, I'd like for you to give and we won't comment on this one, but I want to read it aloud, let you hear it. Read it in the record today, and then let John take 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Is that enough time?
I don't know what you're asking me to do, but yeah, go ahead.
I tell you what, I'll ask you not to comment, but I'll let everybody think about it and think about what is John going to say tomorrow night about this text. Here is one that many people point to, Daniel chapter 12, verses 2 and 3. Many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky, and those who lead the many to righteous like the stars forever and ever. So that'll be a text you discuss tomorrow night at some length. Dr. Goldingay, let me come back to you and ask, why did Jews begin believing that there would be resurrection from the dead? Why did that belief begin?
I think there are two sorts of answers to that. One is that I remember somebody telling me that a survey had been done in the US that had asked people about whether they believed in God and whether they believed in an afterlife. And more people believed in an afterlife than believed in God. Because saying death is all we have is too gloomy. And that's one reason then why belief in an afterlife and in resurrection grows. The other reason is the one that's more implicit in that Daniel passage. It is that resurrection is afterlife, and especially resurrection, is a way of responding to the question, to the declaration. It's not fair that, for instance, people who are faithful to the Lord in that context in Daniel lose their life. God's got to do something about that. And so resurrection is something that people come to believe in the conviction that God has got to be fair.
I had a friend named Allan Siegel. He was a good friend of mine, and perhaps you all knew him. He was a Jewish New Testament scholar who taught at Columbia University. And he wrote a book, The History of the Afterlife, which I thought was a great title, The History of the Afterlife. And he made the claim that Jews began to believe in the resurrection of the dead because of what you've indicated here, in a way that God had promised that the righteous shall live. But what happens when the righteous are martyred at an early age? How does God's promise work itself out? Then God's promise comes to nothing, right? So that was Allan's thought, is that the martyrdoms, particularly the martyrdoms during the Maccabean period, were the martyrdoms that sort of led to the growing belief in life, not only life after death, but the resurrection of the dead. Thoughts, comments? Aubrey?
So it's a lovely theory. Let me think. I have moved away from this theodicy argument because, and it's Alan Siegel presented it very, very well, and it's almost standard in Daniel studies to argue that the reference to resurrection in Daniel 12, we'll find out if it's a reference to resurrection or not tomorrow night, but that emerges because of the martyrdoms. And I think one of the issues with that is that theodicy is not a new problem. This confrontation with death that we see at that moment is not something that we do not see Israel wrestling with up until this point. I mean, the Psalms, I think, are the best example. Right? God, what happens? This is my paraphrase of almost all the Psalms. What happens if I die and I'm separated from you? What then? And so this idea that theodicy kind of led to this new realization that there was unjust death, I think is maybe too simplified and ignores the evidence that Israel was wrestling with the reality of an unjust death for a very long time. Both in their pre-exilic life, there were those, the psalmists like to complain that the rich are living for a very long time and have nice, fat, sleek bodies, and I do not. So they're very aware of this issue. And then we also get the confrontation of exile and the disappointment of the restoration period. So I find myself unconvinced by the argument that it needs to emerge because of a particular theodicy moment. I really think it emerges eventually because of these practices of reading scripture and these metaphors, and then confronting these old questions, the ever-present issue of theodicy, and the question of how God will actually perform all of God's promises to God's people that we've been wrestling with since Abraham, or maybe since before that. So I don't want to say this is incorrect. This is just, that is something I've questioned.
So it's not enough, you think? You don't think?
I don't think it's enough.
It's enough.
I think it presents. I think the Maccabean martyrdoms are terrible, terrible. But there's the Babylonian exile. Yes.
Right. Which was also terrible.
Which was also terrible if you read the Book of Lamentations. And so I think we can tend to say, well, this was the worst one, and so all of a sudden people are like, we need to solve this death problem, and they're like, yeah. And I think we see texts from before that are already wrestling with the issue.
John?
I think also they struggled with the concept of exactly how God's righteousness works out. They've got this idea, of course, in the Old Testament that we call the retribution principle, that the righteous prosper and the wicked suffer. And that means that the righteous theoretically live long, healthy lives and die at a ripe old age surrounded by their family, whereas the wicked will die badly and early. And that's the ultimate. But of course, they were living life. They had experience, and they knew that it didn't work out that way all the time. And so the idea of how then is God's righteousness, his justice, how is that reflected? I mean, we see the psalmist's confidence, optimistic confidence, in Psalm 27, verse 13. I am still confident of this. I will see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Because they had no other options. They didn't have the idea that the righteous would live in heaven with the reward of God and that the wicked would get their due punishment. The Israelites didn't yet have that concept. In my view, others disagree with me, of course. But that's this idea of the retribution principle. And so in one sense, the concept of resurrection, the concept of differentiated afterlife, it's not just strictly theodicy, but it is a question of kind of how does God's economy work here? And how, we sometimes think as Christians that it makes it worthwhile because we're going to have eternity with God. And if we think for a moment that the Israelites may not have had that concept, that puts them in a little bit of debacle, because then why do you live for God if you're not experiencing anything in this life that seems to reflect his justice? And so I can understand why they would start trying to expand beyond the realm of life. And again, I don't think it's just an issue of theodicy, but it's an issue of kind of how can we think about this world?
This suggests itself. Does a doctrine have to be clearly expressed in the Old Testament for it to become valid in the New Testament? In other words, if we don't find a lot of clear evidence for one thing, what about in the New Testament? Are we looking for validity where we don't need to look for validity? Dr. Goldingay, do you have any thoughts on that? If a doctrine...
Well, as I said already, the reason why resurrection isn't there in the Old Testament is because resurrection emerges from the fact that Jesus rose from the dead. And the fact that Jesus rose from the dead generates the resurrection doctrine, and therefore it's quite kind of okay for the resurrection doctrine to be present in the New Testament but not in the Old Testament. There are other aspects of Christian truth which are emphasized more in the Old Testament than in the New. The entire Bible doesn't have to keep saying the same thing all the time. Different things come out in different ways. An example that's relevant maybe to this conversation we're having is the book of Job, that faces that issue that John, for instance, was just talking about. But the book of Job then says, well, in the book of Job, God says to Job, tough, I'm not telling you the answer. And that's much of the time the way the Old Testament lives. So that Old Testament perspective is really quite important again for us, I think, for us to be willing to submit ourselves to God in the kind of way that the book of Job invites us to. And that's a different kind of angle from one that you get out of the New Testament, but they're both important.
Very good. Any other thoughts about that question? I know it's not a yes or no question, but is any other thoughts about, does it have to be present clearly in the Old Testament to be valid? I think Dr. Goldingay had a really interesting response there, but yeah. John?
So we've talked about these passages, Ezekiel 37, Isaiah 26, Psalm 22, Daniel 12, we haven't talked about. Even if we came to the conclusion that none of them talked about resurrection and people in the Old Testament didn't know anything about resurrection, even if you go that full route, that doesn't affect the doctrine of resurrection. We haven't established the doctrine of resurrection from those. We've used them to sometimes support our Christian reading of resurrection, but it's not those that build the doctrine of resurrection. It's, as Dr. Goldingay said, it's based on Jesus and his resurrection and what we're taught in the aftermath of that. So even if we rule those passages out, we're not really damaging the doctrine of resurrection.
I have one of my best friends is a Jewish rabbi, and he, of course, does not accept Jesus to be the Messiah and such, Son of God, those kinds of things. But he does accept the idea of the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. In other words, that day is coming. But he said it's not come yet. It's not started yet. Jesus was not resurrected. But he got that through the Jewish tradition. And that Jewish tradition started with the Hebrew Bible, and it continued to reflect upon the Hebrew Bible in the Mishnah and in the Talmuds and in all the different other ways that Jews sort of express their philosophy and such throughout history. But he still ended up with the idea, yes, there is a resurrection of the dead in the end of the day, but it didn't happen to Jesus, right? But he still came to that belief starting with the Hebrew Bible as a kind of a starting point, I think. Dr. Goldingay?
Well, that fits with the fact that in the Gospels, there's a division between the Pharisees who believe in the resurrection and the Sadducees who don't. So that itself shows how Jews had already come to believe, or some Jews, many Jews, had come to believe in resurrection by New Testament times, by the end of the Second Temple period. Yeah. But they were believing that, as it were, I would say, the terrific thing about Christian faith is that we've got the evidence that there will be resurrection in Jesus' resurrection, whereas otherwise it is believing something on the basis of a kind of theological conviction that you don't have that kind of evidence for.
Interesting. Aubrey?
I'll make this brief because I actually really want to hear what you have to say about some of the Second Temple materials. Because I think this brings up the idea that there is an idea of resurrection that develops before Jesus' time. But I found it helpful to distinguish between, we often say things like, I believe in a resurrection, or I hope in a resurrection, and I would distinguish between those two things. As Christians, we believe in a resurrection because we actually believe in someone who raised from the dead.
It's part of the creed, right?
So we have a doctrine of resurrection, which is a foundation of belief. And I think what emerges, maybe depending on who you ask in these texts, but certainly in Second Temple Judaism, is perhaps what you might call a hope in the resurrection. There wasn't a belief that resurrection had happened, or a doctrine that it would take place in the way that Christians use the term doctrine. But there was an emerging hope that is expressed in these texts. And I found that distinction in my own language to be helpful. Belief is something that you actually believe in rather than hope will occur. So that's something I'm testing out.
I want to come, we've got about 10 minutes left, and that's all. And I want to come to Dr. Perrin, a question for Dr. Perrin, and others can chime in on it as well. In the Second Temple period, and I'd love for you to define what that means, okay? In the Second Temple period, the resurrection of the dead, or the ideas related and associated with resurrection, seem to advance.
New life.
Do what now? What's
New life.
New life.
They take on a new life.
A life of their own.
So yeah, they take on a new life. In other words, what's happening situationally
Sure.
in the Second Temple period that causes that to happen or helps that to happen, and how did the Dead Sea Scrolls and other literature from that period help us and inform us?
Yeah, I love this question, and it probably we've picked up on pieces of it already, so it's probably a good way to maybe put some of them back on the table before we wrap up. So the Second Temple period, we think of the First Temple as Solomon, and that gets demolished in the exiles, and Second Temple is the one that gets rebuilt. It's a little bit awkward in Ezra and Nehemiah. It's kind of not as grand, but that becomes the Temple of Jerusalem. Then it gets rebuilt and expanded all the way into New Testament times under Herod, this massive complex. That's the Second Temple. And so the period we're talking about, because Second Temple period, is when that was kind of the main hub for worship and life in Jerusalem. The Dead Sea Scrolls come from this period. The Septuagint comes from this period. A lot of the writings of the Old Testament are coming together or are received in this period. And we have other writings of this period. By the end of the Second Temple period, the Romans demolish the temple in 68. So that's kind of a decisive end. When we look at writings from this period, Septuagint scrolls, we also have others. One thing that Aubrey mentioned is, I think, if I heard you correctly, you're getting at this is older. This conversation is older than the mid-second century when Antiochus has oppressed, Jewish communities and disrupted temple worship. We have a very direct response to that that involves an expectation or a hope of resurrection in 2 Maccabees 18, I believe. The Jewish martyrs of the Maccabees, their political theology becomes very tightly wed with martyrdom is going. You'll get these limbs back.
Get what? Say that again.
You'll get these limbs back. There will be an expectation of your being put back together in some way after this. That, I would argue, is the clearest place we have something like this in the Second Temple period. But as Aubrey said, this is not, sort of paraphrasing you, this doesn't seem to be a silver bullet, that this explains everything in this period, that everybody's somehow responding to this crisis that of Hellenism against the Jerusalem establishment and temple worship. We know that because writings like First Enoch, which is probably 3rd century in Aramaic, some of the early materials in what's called the Book of Watchers. First Enoch 22, Enoch's taken on a visionary journey, and he sees the abodes of the righteous and the wicked, and they'll be raised for some sort of judgment. Well, that suggests there's something coming. The Book of Giants, Aramaic Book of Giants, is asking this question about evil from the flood and giants, and the answer that gives is, okay, the giants' bodies died in the flood, but they'll get theirs because their spirits there'll be eschatological judgment. This is all before the 2nd century. All of that is there. I think it's also really important, we've seen that there's a lot of voices speaking to this, but then you also have the continuation of very traditional voices, like the wisdom book of Ben Sira, or Ecclesiasticus. I think it's in Ben Sira 15 and 41, somewhere in both those chapters. Ben Sira goes, it's like, you live for God, then you die. Like, stop complaining. That's what this life is about. is this very traditional response of death that's much more in keeping with some of the earlier views that we started with, that Dr. Goldingay outlined. So I don't think that in this period we have one answer. We have many answers. Not all of them are expectant and optimistic and hopeful. Some of them are in direct response to a crisis with empire. Some have been asking that question for centuries, and others are still accepting or even unpacking a very traditional answer. But the thought that develops in the literature out of this period is foundational for how we do that historical, cultural, and theological homework for Hebrew scriptures, as well as, I think, Christian origins in different ways.
All right, we're coming up on the end. I want to say thank you to those who helped and make this program possible. We've got several of our staff people. If you see somebody wearing this gold piece here, they cannot be trusted. No, I'm just sorry. No, they are our staff people, and they are lovely people. They make everything happen here. I'm so grateful for them and all that they do. Please thank our panelist as well as Dr. Goldingay from afar. There's a lot here left unsaid that needs to be said tomorrow night, and John has promised to wrap this all up and make sense out of all of it tomorrow night. Are you going to do that, John?
Is that belief or hope?
That's a hope. That's a hope, I have to say. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for being a part of this today. God bless you. We'll look forward to seeing you next time, perhaps tomorrow night. God bless. Dr. Goldingay, thank you very much. Thank you so much. Thank you for being a part of this.
Trying to push the limits.
firm you were on that foundation.
We can't.